Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Tania. I'm a PhD student in the history department here at Manchester. In my PhD research, I look at women's suffrage activists in the UK and the US. Specifically, I look at this tactic of sex striking, so refusing to have sex for political purposes, in this case, to get the vote. I look at that as an idea in late 19th and early 20th century feminism. But today I'm going to be talking about something much broader than that. I'm going to be talking about this concept that many of you probably have heard of, that feminism is something that happens in waves. And we're going to be really questioning from a historiographical perspective whether we like that analogy, whether it holds up anymore. So I'm just going to share my screen now because I've prepared a presentation. Sorry, 1 second, my presentation's not coming up. Here it is. So here is an article from International Women's Day last year, which has this headline, 2020s mark a new wave of feminist mobilization. And I've chosen this partly because we're all convening as part of Women's Month, but also I think it really evidences that this concept that feminism is something that happens in waves is still very alive in popular imagination and popular language, even if it's something that that historians have been questioning for a long time in academic scholarship. But so, if you're unfamiliar, what do we mean by these waves? So the wave analogy is sometimes used to suggest that feminism takes place, it achieves the aims of one movement, it dies down, and then a couple of decades later, a new generation of women have new grievances, and a new wave emerges. The most common and simple view presents arguably 4 waves. So we have the first wave, which is thought as happening from the mid-19th century to about 1920. And this, in this common understanding, is really defined by the fight for the vote, women's suffrage. Then there's a second wave, which takes place from the 1960s to the early 1980s. It's associated with figures like Gloria Steinem and before that Betty Friedan. And it's associated with issues such as women's role within the home and discontent with domesticity. Now, I call this 4-wave model the common and the simple view, but even if we accept the wave model, at this point, things get a bit complicated. Different public commentators disagree over how many waves there have been so far and when they took place. So it's largely agreed that there was a third wave in the 1990s, which was defined by a series of things such as individualism, or what we might now call choice feminism, the idea that feminism is all about women having the choice to do certain things, the riot girl feminist punk music scene, and also by the development of the idea of intersectionality, most associated with Kimberly Crenshaw. Now, some claim we are still in an extended third wave of feminism. Others claim that this 1990s feminism died down and that there's been a 4th wave from the 2010s to the present. So where does this wave metaphor come from? We can date it to 1968, so during this second wave, when a New York Times article by Martha Wyman Lear ran under the headline, "The Second Feminist Wave." Second wave feminists found it useful to argue that their activism was not a crazy aberration from social norms, but that had a history. And so this wave analogy has always really relied on ideas of both similarity and difference. The waves are meant to be different from each other, but they're meant to have this shared history. So when I was 16, I joined a feminist club at my school. It was literally just someone in the year above me in sixth form set up a feminist club. It was about 12 of us meeting in a room on a Tuesday lunchtime in a classroom to talk about feminism, just at my local comprehensive school. I can't tell you how low-key this was, but there was massive press interest in us. Here's an article about us in The Guardian. I'm pictured there with the red hair and the blue top. And we have this headline, Feminist Hail Explosion in New Grassroots Groups. And the reason why The Guardian was interested in this group of teenagers is because at that time, a school feminist group seemed unprecedented. In fact, one journalist did claim that at that point we were the only school feminist group in existence in the whole UK. I don't know if that was true or not, but I would believe that for some of you who've been at school more recently, the idea of your school having a feminist club doesn't seem so rare that it should be in a national newspaper. And certainly for me at the time, it did feel like you could say this was the start of a new wave of something. It felt like 1 week I was scared of calling myself a feminist because it was a dirty word, and 2 weeks later it was really cool to be in the school feminist club. And we can see similar feelings being demonstrated in primary sources from previous generations. So in a magazine called The 19th Century, which existed in the Victorian era, in an 1894 article entitled The Revolt of the Daughters, public attention was attracted around this idea of rebellious young women. And many of the young women who wrote in asserted their right to call themselves suffragists. They wanted to be able to have the freedom to make their own mistakes, travel freely, travel safely at night, visit the music halls with their brothers, and access improved education. And some of these girls really saw themselves in contrast with their parents' generation, who they thought didn't share these same values about women's liberation. So this is really where this concept of waves comes from. But does it actually hold up? And are the testimonies of those of us who are active in social movements always sufficient for understanding where those movements come from? Some historians argue that actually, if you're participating in a social movement, you're likely to think of the big seismic events that inspired you, but you're less likely to be aware of the more gradual social processes that may still be holding your movement up without you being fully aware of that. So are sources from the 19th century or from me sufficient? Over the past decade, historians have increasingly argued that the wave model of feminism is indeed insufficient for understanding the history of feminism. Some have even argued that the wave model is actively misleading. We can see different historiographical opinions on the wave model as being the result of two phenomena. The first is differing methodology. This is where the historical discipline comes in. When we talk of feminist waves, are we talking about feminist social movements? Are we talking about feminist ideas? Are we talking about laws and policies and mainstream impact? The kinds of sources that historians prioritize have sometimes led to their different opinions on the wave model. The second phenomenon significant to us here is the definition of feminism. Questioning the wave model leads us to question the definition of feminism itself. Feminism is not one monolithic ideology. It's always incorporated different currents and disagreements. Since the advent of the term, there have been socialist feminists and liberal feminists and religious feminists. Can we understand someone as a feminist who didn't use the term to describe themselves? Can we use feminism to describe periods of history where the word didn't even exist yet? Are all groups seeking to make women's lives better feminist, or do these groups have to subscribe to a specific ideology? Is this ideology, in turn, just about equality with men, or is it more complicated than that? What does equality even mean from a feminist perspective? And to what extent can it accept and embrace gender difference? Do historians have to come up with a universal definition of feminism to study it, or can they just accept the premise that the word meant different things to different people at different times? Your answer to these questions will almost certainly influence your opinion on the wave model. As we will explore, other historians have sought to bridge the gap between the waves, looking at feminist activism which nevertheless existed between the 1920s and the 1950s, or in the late 1980s, which in the traditional wave model are periods where the water is meant to be calm. In these middle decades between the waves, working class women and women of colour are more likely to come to the forefront as movement leaders. However, some of these attempts to bridge the gap in the wave model have themselves come under criticism for not paying enough attention to historical differences that existed between different time periods, or for including women under the umbrella of feminism who did not necessarily choose to identify with the term. And we'll explore that a bit more at the end. But these differing methodological approaches and definitions of feminism have led different historians to put forward alternatives to the wave model. So they're not just trying to bridge the gap, they're trying to break out of the whole wave paradigm and think of new metaphors. So rather than bridging the gap between the waves, Lynn Abrams has suggested we think of feminism as a causeway over water. Causeways, more than bridges, facilitate movement in both directions, she claims, allowing us to see how a wide range of groups, which could be described as feminists, have influenced each other over time. Catherine Gleadle has gone even further in putting forward a non-linear analogy, suggesting that we think of feminism as a tree root structure, with different, sometimes seemingly disconnected growth points, dead ends, and patterns of influence. Nancy Hewitt has upheld the wave model, but based the idea on radio waves instead of ocean waves. She says we can think of feminism as competing broadcasts, some coming through loud and clear, some obscured and disrupted by static, therefore encapsulating some of the tensions in the history of feminism. Most recently, Lucy Delap has developed the analogy of mosaic feminism, to specifically remove the focus on the Western world and capture global feminist history. She suggests we can piece together a picture of different feminist localities, sometimes influencing each other, sometimes not. She continues that sometimes the pieces will be different simply because of the different materials available to feminists in different regional contexts, and sometimes the movement will look very different from afar to when each piece is examined close up. So today we will start to explore some of these questions ourselves. We will be asking what happened between the waves. Who does the wave model include and leave out? And were the waves really that different from each other? And I'll return to this slide at the end, and hopefully you can all form your own opinions on which of these analogies you think works. So, the first wave. Here we're going to think a bit about whether I'm sorry, I've just seen the comment about my slides. I will stop sharing. Hopefully this is better. So we're going to think a bit about the first wave now, and the extent to which the wave model is even useful for analysing the waves themselves and all the people who made up these moments. So the first wave is often seen as synonymous with suffragism, which in turn was traditionally cast as a single issue movement, just centred around achieving the vote. You may find this surprising, but in both the UK and the US, some women legally had voting rights prior to the 19th century, if they met all the property and residential qualifications applied to men, which was incredibly rare for women to achieve in practice. In one US territory immediately after the revolution, all women, regardless of race, regardless of any other qualification, could be eligible to vote if they met the property qualifications that were required of men. Now, this is significant for us because one of the problems with the wave model is it can be seen to suggest progress. Waves obviously all move forward in one direction, and so it can suggest that as time goes on, things are always getting better for all women. And as I'm sure many of you will know, if we look at many historical eras in more detail, we find that isn't the case. So soon after the American Revolution, legislative clauses denying voting rights on the grounds of sex were implemented across the country. In the UK, sex was first introduced as an explicit disqualification from voting under the Great Reform Act of 1832. Movements seeking to repeal these clauses began in the following decades on both sides of the Atlantic. And this context is significant to us when thinking about waves, as there is perhaps a popular misconception that in the 19th century, women just suddenly woke up to the injustices of a disenfranchisement that they'd all been suffering for decades without complaining. But the legal context is more complex than this, and the Anglo-American 19th century women's suffrage movements can, at least in part, be seen as a reaction to this changing legal picture. In the US, the advent of the women's suffrage movement is attributed to the 1848 Seneca Falls Conference, led by women such as Lucretia Mott, who had already been politicized in the slavery abolition movement. It's also worth noting that the famous Black campaigner Frederick Douglass was a really significant ally. He was there himself as a man, really showing what we might now term solidarity and advocating for votes for women. So the campaign for women's suffrage varied widely across the US, and their legal system meant that different states were able to grant voting rights at different times from 1869 onwards. And the federal discrimination from voting, specifically on the grounds of sex, was removed in 1920. But this didn't mean that all women could vote. Many women still faced insurmountable barriers to voting on the grounds of sex. All this law did was say specifically, on the grounds of race, all the law did was specifically say that you're not disqualified from voting because you're a woman, but that doesn't mean that all women can vote. In Britain, the suffrage movement gained momentum a little later in 1866, when the first mass Votes for Women petition was presented to Parliament, and this was signed by about 1,500 names. Millicent Fawcett was one of the leaders of this early movement, which was largely associated with more peaceful protesting tactics. While the distinction between suffragists and suffragettes that you may have heard of was in reality not as significant as early historians claimed, the later movement was associated with the Pankhurst family and their staunch commitment to radical and violent protest methods, such as the destruction of property. Some women were given the right to vote, subject to property and residency conditions in 1918, and all sex differences in voting rights were then eliminated the following decade. So when assessing this as a feminist wave, we have lots of questions to ask. On the one hand, there's maybe some sense in it. We have a transatlantic movement coalescing around a shared aim, responding to some of the same legal contextual factors, and following a roughly similar timeline. This perhaps helps us understand again why feminists reached for that wave analogy in the first place. However, as you can see, these movements lasted for 60 or 70 years, spanning at least 3 generations. Many of the women who originated the campaigns did not live to see them come to fruition. Is this then one big wave? We should also not assume that such a long-lasting campaigns were monolithic. These movements were complex as any enduring movement led by men. And they differed significantly between different eras, different regions, different political factions, and different individuals. Since the 1980s, historians have successfully challenged the misconception of the suffrage movement as a so-called single-issue campaign. They've challenged the centrality of the vote as a shared aim. Especially in the British context, these historians have established that late 19th and early 20th century feminists largely saw the vote as a means to an end, to challenge a whole range of issues, largely concerning women's rights to sexual autonomy and to freedom at home in the domestic sphere. Concerns such as challenging sexual double standards between men and women, challenging unequal marriage and divorce laws, challenging the assumption that all women should marry, all women should have a male life partner, were all key issues, and for some radical factions, things like contraception and the right to sex outside marriage were key issues as well. In a critique of the labour women were performing at home, which feels like it could be taken out of a contemporary newspaper column, the suffrage-supporting novelist Mona Caird wrote in 1888, "Father and mother are to share pleasantly between them the rights and duties of parenthood, the father having the rights and the mother having the duties." Elizabeth Wollstonecraft, it's a shame you can't see her picture because I can't tell you how much she looks like just that stereotype of a repressed, dowdy Victorian older woman. But she had a life partner, Ben Elmy, who she became pregnant with outside of marriage. And in 1897, they published an account of their first sexual experience together to encourage other couples to imagine a feminist vision of a happy sexual relationship outside the bounds of marriage. So accounts like the Elmys from 1897 aren't just fascinating, they help us consider how effective the wave model even is for understanding the supposed waves themselves. One of the assumptions of the model has often been that each wave was distinct, as I said. But questioning the extent to which the first wave was actually centred around the vote allows us to see stark similarities that existed between 19th century feminism and later generations, questioning the utility of understanding the movement as a series of waves at all. Significantly, all of the women I've mentioned so far are white, and almost all of them were pretty economically privileged. And this brings us to another significant critique of the wave model, that it was formed based on movements led by middle and upper class white women. We will end by assessing some of the working class and black-led movements which existed between the waves. But first, we need to consider the diversity of the waves themselves. The debate about the waves is often framed in terms of who we centre. So, some historians of the 1930s and 40s would argue that to really understand the history of feminism, we need to centre those decades, especially if we want to understand its diversity. And whilst those are really compelling arguments, we also want to be careful, especially from a popular memory point of view, that we don't lose sight of the diversity of the waves themselves, and that we want to be careful that we don't forget to remember the activists beyond the leadership, even at the height of 19th and early 20th century feminism. So I'm just going to share with you 3 case studies of women involved in the first wave of feminism who you might not have heard of. Obviously, there are so many people who I could have brought up, and it was really hard choosing just 3. But hopefully this will help us answer some of these broader questions about the history of feminist thought and when and who we bring to the forefront. So first, I'm going to talk about Ida B. Wells. I've got pictures of all these people, so I might just very quickly see if I can share my screen again. Let's see if this works. Dad, sorry, can you see this slide?
Yep.
Okay, I'll try it with the slides for a bit. We can see. So this is Ida B. Wells. Wells was born to enslaved parents in Mississippi in 1862, 6 months before the Emancipation Proclamation granted their freedom. In her late 20s, when working as a teacher, she became politicized by racial segregation in the school system. This sparked her 40 years of activism. She became a famous journalist, suffragist, and anti-lynching campaigner, and was among the founding members of the NAACP. She was so influential she had international reach, and her fame took her to England in 1893. However, this fame did not protect Wells from serious discrimination from some of her fellow women suffrage advocates. Wells was the only Black member of the Illinois branch of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Associations in the US. This was a big national suffrage group. She attended the 1930 Women's Suffrage Procession in Washington, which was a very significant march. It's a really significant event in US women's suffrage history. She was there. But the white members of the group remained divided over whether to obey orders from the parade's organizers to segregate the Illinois bloc and force Wells to march at the back of the parade, not with her Illinois branch, because she's a Black woman. Wells played a very significant role in convincing the Illinois faction to remain integrated. However, African American women, including Wells, were then excluded from many of the event photographs, their contributions deliberately obscured by the white suffragists there. And so I think this is really significant to us, again, in thinking about how much it's time to move on from focusing on these eras of activism, especially in popular language, especially if our justification is that these eras lack diversity. Whilst they, of course, the racism that exists within this moment needs to be at the forefront of our discussion of it. We can't understand it without thinking about Wells and her experience. At the same time, we can question, are we actually enacting this racist decision to exclude Wells and her African American suffragist counterparts from the photos by dismissing this era as having been looked at sufficiently because it wasn't diverse enough? Wells was at this march, even if she isn't in the pictures, and it's important we remember her and her comrades. Now here's a British suffragette, Annie Kenney. So the militant suffragette movement in Britain was initiated by a working class suffragette. Annie had been a factory worker in a cotton mill in Lancashire. In October 1905, it was Annie Kenney, alongside Christabel Pankhurst, who attended Sir Edward Grey's meeting at the Free Trade Hall and demanded of him, "Will the Liberal government give votes to women?" The actions of Kenney and Pankhurst on this day are widely understood as the first ever acts of suffrage militancy. Kenney remained in the inner circle of the Pankhurst Women's Social and Political Union, but the group maintained a highly complex relationship with class. They claimed to be classless, if we think such a thing is even possible. The first edition of their newspaper, Votes for Women, asserted, "If you have any class feeling, you must leave that behind when you come into this movement." However, historians have long explored how this did not reflect the reality, and case studies like Annie Kenney's here are key. On the one hand, some of her close relationships with women from other classes were rare for Edwardian Britain, and she represents an unusual moment of cross-class friendship and political collaboration, which is important to note. Here we have on the right, the picture is Annie Kenney and Christabel Pankhurst having dinner together in this quite middle-class seemingly setting. But then on the left, we have this very different picture of Annie Kenney. On the other hand, Kenney was often asked to use her working class roots for publicity purposes, dressing up as the stereotype of a mill girl to attract attention and to present a particular image of femininity which would disrupt stereotypes of the suffragettes. As part of this, we can see that Kenney was asked to speak for all working class women, rather than a greater number of such women from her background being represented at the top of the WSPU themselves. Beyond the WSPU, there is evidence of class concerns being taken more seriously by suffragettes. There was a vibrant socialist suffrage movement, encapsulated in Sylvia Pankhurst's, this was another Pankhurst sister, breakaway faction, the East London Federation of Suffragettes. There are, for example, records of some suffrage campaigners debating the class accessibility of militant protest, which necessitated arrest, as this required a bigger risk from working class women who might lose their jobs than their middle class counterparts. The final person we're going to look at, just to consider the diversity of what is known as the first wave. Oh no, is this slide not appearing? No, it's here now. Is Vera Jack Holme. So Holme can certainly be understood as queer, although it's hard to describe Holme using terms which they did not have access to. Holme was certainly someone who romantically loved women, and aspects of Holme's identity, including the chosen name Jack, were highly masculine, which provokes the question of whether Holme could be understood as a transgender man or non-binary person. Building on existing studies of gender non-conforming Victorians, I will refer to Jack Holme, as she seems to have referred to herself, with a traditionally masculine name but with female pronouns and the gender marker woman. But I think it's really important to recognise that we have no idea how Jack would have identified if she'd had access to a wider range of language. But we can look at how Jack lived her life. So Jack Holme was given a role working as the official WSPU chauffeur, and was dubbed the first female in the profession in Britain in the press. This work enabled her to sport short hair and a masculine uniform. It also facilitated the construction of a masculine literary identity, not only calling herself Jack, but publicly demanding to be referred to as a chauffeur, rather than chauffess, this sort of made-up feminized word, which some of the leading automobile magazines at the time assumed would be the right term to refer to Jack. But Jack resisted this. Not all aspects of Jack Holme's masculine identity were wholly embraced within the WSPU. The pseudonym Jack seems to have been predominantly employed by the bohemian circle of friends that Jack moved in, and the suffrage movement almost universally addressed Jack as Vera, although Jack didn't object to this in that context. Sylvia Pankhurst referred to Holme as a noisy, explosive young person, frequently rebuked by elders for lack of dignity, which is obviously a very loaded description. However, while it does seem that Holme's gender nonconformity was received with this scepticism by WSPU members, in other ways, the suffrage leadership not only supported but enabled this part of Jack's life. It was Emmeline Pankhurst who initially employed Holme as a chauffeur, and in doing so, raised no recorded objection to the masculine title or appearance that Jack chose for themselves. Jack Holme simultaneously left records of a deep, passionate relationship with fellow suffragette Evelina Haverfield, and two other potentially intimate same-sex attractions during the years of suffrage activism. Holme and Haverfield shared a cottage together in Devon, which housed a double bed engraved with their respective initials, EH and VH. So we can think about these women, these people, in the context of the movement that came after them. And this will help us just make some concluding comments on the wave analogy. So women certainly carried on being politically active in all sorts of ways between 1920 and the 1960s. But there's no one answer regarding what this means for a history of feminism. New research is being done on this period all the time. For example, Keisha Blaine has recently published groundbreaking work on Black nationalist women in the US in the 30s and 40s, which uses women's activism to heavily challenge the received wisdom that the so-called golden age of black nationalism lasted from 1850 to 1920, only to be revised again in the 1970s. And Blaine's most recent work on these women was published just this week. So this really is something that historians are very much still discussing and debating. Some historians have redefined feminism so that any women's group of the mid-20th century can fit under the term. For example, historian Lorna Gibson has argued that women's institute groups, the WI groups you might have heard of the 1950s and 60s, should be seen as a part of the history of ordinary women's feminism. In order to understand this as a linear history, she proposes a new definition of moderate feminism or empowerment, so that organizations like the WI can be included in the history of the women's movement. This is justified on the grounds that they allowed women to have fulfilled lives within traditional social constructions of gender and acceptance of patriarchy. This has provoked criticism from other historians who reject such a redefinition of feminism. But there are other groups from the 30s, 40s, and 50s who we can centre who were not so discordant with dominant definitions of feminism. Ironically, some of these groups were not women's groups at all, but included within them a more obviously feminist message than women's organisations of the age, such as the WI. US historian Dorothy Cobble has coined the term social justice feminism to describe the specific brand of women's activism which existed between the 30s and the 60s. She claims these feminists specifically believed that women faced group disadvantages as a sex, but they combined this with an equal commitment to racial and economic justice. Cobble has demonstrated how Jewish immigrant women in the labour movement and black women in the NAACP can be understood as part of this school of mid-20th century feminism. One example pictured is Addie Wyatt. She broke down barriers by being elected vice president of her local union in 1952, which was an unusual accomplishment for a woman of the time. And just 2 years later, she was appointed to the national executive of the National Packing House Workers Union, on a platform which emphasised both women's rights and the advancement of racial minorities. Cobble, the historian, therefore challenges us to consider that just because a group was not wholly dedicated to women's issues does not mean that the women active within it lacked a feminist analysis of power structures. Therefore, perhaps looking at the time in between the waves sometimes requires us to separate out a history of women's groups from a history of feminist thought. But it does not mean that either phenomena failed to exist in the mid-20th century. Yet Cobble also acknowledges that social justice feminism was not a widely shared view from the 30s to the 50s, causing us to still ask whether there is utility in trying to identify particular historical moments where feminism was especially popular, or whether feminism is just too complex an ideology for that to be accomplished. Cobble also notes that the positive representations of the family and marriage, which feminists tended to uphold in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, made this a less libertary era for queer and gender non-conforming people. So what does this mean for people like Jack Holme? Ultimately, I want you all to think critically about which metaphor of feminism you think best fits in light of these case studies. Or maybe you think we still need to find a new symbol altogether. I'd really welcome any questions now, and I'll just put these different waves back on the screen for you all to think about. Sorry, not waves, different analogies.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I found it really, really interesting. The issues that were faced in Victorian era are still being faced today. For example, the issues of police involvement in protests and how using arrest as a protest tactic puts certain groups at a disadvantage, and also the place of trans and non-binary people in feminism. It was really interesting to hear about Jack Holme. So that thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I'm just sat here like, wow, this is great.
Oh, thank you for having me.
We don't seem to have any questions in the chat at the moment, but I'll give it a couple more minutes. In the meantime, are you on social media? Do you want to share any handles or your email so people could ask you further questions?
Yeah, of course. Shall I put it in the chat? Is that easiest?
Yeah.
How does it?
Yeah, if anyone has any questions for Tania, please do comment them.
Oh, sorry, that sent twice.
And Tania's Twitter is in the comments. But yeah, I hope this has helped people to sort of understand the history of feminism and how, although it can be described as waves, that doesn't necessarily mean that feminism has ever stopped.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Yeah, so there don't seem to be any comments, so I'm going to end the live stream here. But yeah, Tania's Twitter and email are in the comments, so if you want to reach out, then you can. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching, and thank you so much, Tania, for this presentation. It's been really enlightening, and everyone have a great rest of your week. We have a final event for Women's History Month tomorrow, which is a Q&A with disability activist Kate O'Reilly, hosted by Jess Edwards, one of our disabled students part-time officers. She'll be talking about the intersections of gender and disability, and being a female disabled playwright and dramaturge, and the disabled people's civil rights movement in the UK, and also the social model of disability. So tune in for that tomorrow at 6 p.m. And yeah, everyone have a great week. See you soon. Bye.